Hello. Hello, everyone. So, requesting audience to please be seated. We can start the session. My name is Ratnakar Gokhale. I am here on behalf of Chokur Sumling, Buddhist Meditation and Study Center at Bangalore. Is one of the organizers here. So, welcome all to session number 7. The theme of our session is Scope of Consciousness Studies in Neuroscience, Buddhist Philosophy, and Quantum Physics. So, duration of the session will be 1 hour 45 minutes. I now call upon to the esteemed panelists on the stage, and please they take their seats. Professor Ravindra Nagendra, Chairperson. Dr. Joseph Irving Thomas, sir. Ms. Tejal Shah, and Father Dr. Matthew Chandrakunil. So welcome, madam. Welcome, sirs. I would like to present, give a brief introduction to the chairperson. Professor Ravindra Nagendra is a former professor and head of physiology at GIMS Gatak. Currently, he is with Center of Sleep and Consciousness Studies in NIMHANS, Bangalore. He has presented many papers, presentations at various prestigious conferences in India and abroad. He published widely in many peer-reviewed journals. He was also awarded APPI Prakriti Mandir Prize for research in yoga. He was also a recipient of Mind and Life Institute Fellowship for Summer Research School in Garrison Institute. He is a regular volunteer at Ramakrishna Ashram. I know this is a session after lunch and a very interesting time for presentation with full mind and tummies full and mind drifting, but I'm sure the speakers will keep us riveted to the topic. With no further ado, I request Chairperson to take over the session. To you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon for all of you. At the onset, I thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity, and also my deep apologies that yesterday I could not able to be here for my session, and I had already informed the organizers a couple of days back that because now we are starting the Center for Sleep and Consciousness Studies at NIMHANS, and we had a very important meeting over there, and we are setting up the whole department and the center with approaching the understanding the problem of consciousness from the transdisciplinary approach, where just I will take a few minutes because for the general information about the audience, that they should know that this is the only center under the Government of India and in the Institute of National Importance that is coming up, and where I'm the faculty over there now, where I joined just 2 weeks back, probably at NIMHANS, and where we are trying to approach the consciousness from understanding consciousness from neuroscience point of view, and we are eager to recruit the faculty who are interested or who have a very sound ground knowledge from neuroscience and Buddhist philosophy also. And it's a permanent position is going to come up. It's for the larger audience to keep this in mind. In case if you see any advertisement, you can please apply for that. And also we faculty position will be coming up where if you have a sound knowledge of neuroscience and also physics, a permanent faculty's position is coming up. And also a position will be coming up where you have a sound knowledge with cognitive neuroscience and philosophy also. So probably this is the only institute, probably I think, where people who are interested in and who have a deep knowledge in both these transdisciplinary approaches that unique things are or is coming up at NIMHANS, and where we can do a lot of work. So I think probably in the next meeting, Gesheji from Center of Consciousness, so we have lot of representation over here, including with Dr. Bindu. So now we are going to have this session 8 of this wonderful conference on the scope of consciousness studies in neuroscience, Buddhist philosophy and quantum physics. And from the neuroscience point of view, we understand a lot of unconsciousness in neuroscience. Somebody comes, say, in a head injury, is unconscious. You, under the different level of anesthesia, is unconscious. And there are many other things where he can lose his consciousness. But the consciousness is not just a reverse of unconsciousness. We have clearly understood how this unconscious process that can happen in the brain when you give anesthesia or when you go to sleep, probably, what happens in the brain. But the same reverse process is not consciousness. So consciousness is something very unique that comes there. So there are so many hidden variables for us to understand how actually this consciousness emerges. This is what I was discussing at the lunch with Dr. Mukhopadhyaya. That why neurons as a very unique cell, because when these different forms of neurons, when they interact at different level, a new property will emerge. And this ability is nature has given only for your brain cells. You may be having millions of liver cells, but all these, when liver cells they interact, there is no emergence of a new property. But it's only the neurons where the new property will emerge. So whenever there is a new property is going to emerge from these identically behaving cells as an individually, there are so many hidden variables. And understanding of these hidden variables, probably where I think these transdisciplinary approach to try to understand these emergent properties from neuroscience point of view is what I think we have to try to understand. So with this brief background, so we have a very learned panel. Dr. Joseph is here, where of course he has a very heterogeneous, multiple interest and expertise. So for I think for his day-to-day living, he's assistant professor in the Department of Physiology, but his passion is for something else, for which he is adjunct faculty at Natural Sciences and Engineering at National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. His expertise in mathematics, computational neuroscience, and also medical science, physiology. So you have a multiple specialty in one basket called Dr. Joseph Thomas. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the wonderful way they've carried out this conference by inviting so many illustrious and esteemed speakers from different parts of the country to talk on this very enigmatic topic of consciousness and its various facets. Most importantly, I want to thank the Tibet House for inviting me to be a part of this conference once more. The topic I'll be speaking about is on the scope of consciousness studies in neuroscience, Buddhist philosophy, and quantum physics. It's not possible to speak about all of these topics in 20 minutes, but I'll try my best. So the study of consciousness as a scientific discipline, not just a scientific discipline, but even as a philosophical venture worth spending time on, it's been going on for a long time. In fact, if you look at its roots, it goes all the way back thousands of years to the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle in the West, and even in the East, many of our esteemed philosophers as well. Many psychologists and psychiatrists like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung in Europe, and William James in America, they too studied consciousness for maybe over the last 100 years. And very recently, in the last 10 or 20 years, maximum 30 or 40 years, not more than that, neuroscientists, physicists, and mathematicians like V.S. Ramachandran and Roger Penrose have also entered the scene. I think it would be right if I begin my talk with a very, very brief history of consciousness studies. You see these two gentlemen here. He's one of the men who discovered the structure of the DNA molecule. His name is Francis Crick, and there's one of his students, former students, Christoph Koch. In 1990, they wrote this one sentence in one of their seminal papers. They remarked that in neuroscience today, that is in 1990, there's barely any reference to that very term consciousness. But ever since they've written that remark, over the last 20 years, there's been an explosion in the number of papers that have been produced on the topic. In fact, it's become a multidisciplinary subject simply because so many different players have entered the scene. People from psychology, psychiatry, philosophy, computer science, even mathematicians and medical doctors have entered the scene as well. So why do you think this would have happened? Well, I feel the reason is because of this man, Sir Isaac Newton. The reason why I feel it's Isaac Newton is because it's only after Isaac Newton proposed all his theories in classical physics that we've had some kind of an edge over the forces of nature. Because of his work, we can now, launch rockets into space, put satellites in orbit around the Earth, send probes to distant planets. We can even predict the position of stars and galaxies many, years hence. So that predictive power, or that predictive success and explanatory success that the Newtonian classical physics has given mankind, has also given mankind the confidence that maybe one day consciousness too can be understood, can be studied, can be predicted, can be explained using very simple physical principles. In the middle of the 20th century, a new science emerged. It's called cognitive science. Cognitive means mind. So the science of the mind, it started gaining root and a foundation. The reason why cognitive science was established was because of a whole lot of diverse subfields, you could say, subfields which merged together and formed this huge tree trunk called cognitive science. They include cybernetics, information theory, Turing machine, computer machines, and machines that can actually be programmed. In other words, cognitive science came into effect because of the invention of the computer. And along with the advent of cognitive science, this new paradigm entered the scientific literature. That is, man is a programmable machine, just like a computer, where the brain acts as the hardware, or the CPU, and the mind acts as the software, that is, Windows. Around 30 years later, in the 1980s, a man by the name David Marr came along, and he wrote this very interesting book called Vision. That kind of revolutionized that paradigm that man is just a programmable machine. And he added one more statement, that is, the brain is even computational in nature. And that led to the development of something called computational neuroscience. Now, what is computational neuroscience? In his book, he describes what a system is in order for it to be computational. It should consist of at least four things. One, the system should have a goal, a grand goal, something to achieve. The next thing is a plan to achieve that goal. And the third thing are these micro steps, baby steps within the plan to help achieve that goal. And finally, the material resources which actually help implement that plan. So we call them computation, algorithm, representation, and mechanism. These are the four technical terms for that. Now, the best way to illustrate it is from a simple example in physics. It's called a spring mass system. A spring mass system is nothing more than just a spring with one end fixed, perhaps on the roof, and the other end is free. And on that free end, you can load a mass. When you load a mass, what happens is the spring stretches. And depending on the weight of that load, if it's a small weight, the stretch will be a small stretch. If it's a large weight, you'll get a large stretch. So if, let's say we have a weight W1, we load it, we get a stretch of X1. And if we add to that another load, W2, what happens is the stretch increases even further. And what's interesting is it follows this equation called Hooke's law, where force or the weight is directly proportional to the displacement. So what in effect happens is, if you can measure the total displacement because of the two masses, you can actually use this formula to compute the weight of the combined system. In other words, the spring mass system is actually doing a computation. It's adding weights. So according to the computational paradigm, the brain is doing something very simple. It's just adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. It's doing all kinds of basic operations, which in the end results in consciousness. But then people started thinking, wait a minute, just because the spring mass system happens to be doing an addition operation, it isn't really aware of doing addition, is it? It's just obeying a law of physics called Hooke's law. So how can we say that, the spring mass system is conscious? So that could very well be, the same thing with the brain. Just because the brain at the neuronal level or group neuronal level, individual neuronal level, it's doing some kind of a computation by following some algorithm, it doesn't mean that it's aware of the fact that it's following an algorithm. So that's a failure of the computational system. Now, the reason why consciousness became such a popular field in science today, an independent field, is perhaps you can say it's because of this man. In the middle of the 1990s, David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher, he made a series of publications in which he identifies two sets of problems when a person tries to study what consciousness is. One set of problems he called the hard problem of consciousness. Now, this is the toughest problem to crack. It may be even uncrackable, intractable. What is the hard problem of consciousness is simply, why should any brain state, that is the electrical and chemical activity that's going on in the brain at the molecular level or even at the atomic level, why should that be associated with any kind of feeling? Why should it be that just because sodium or potassium or chloride or calcium, magnesium, doesn't matter what the element is going in and out of a neuron, why should that make me happy or sad? Why should that make me feel, confident or lack of confidence? Why does an internal state have to come about, has to bring about an external manifestation in the form of consciousness? So that's basically what the hard problem of consciousness is. How do we connect the inner life to the outer life? Then there are these easy problems of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness, by the way, is by no way easy. They are very difficult. In fact, they form the bread and butter of all neuroscientists who are doing intensive research on the consciousness. One example is the first one, the ability to discriminate between objects. For example, if you're given a big bowl of fruits, your ability to assort those fruits into oranges, apples, bananas, etc., that ability is the ability to discriminate between objects by identification. That's an easy problem of consciousness. It's not too difficult. It can be done. Another example of an easy problem would be, what is the difference between wakefulness and sleep? There's a lot of research on sleep medicine and sleep physiology. Those are easy problems. They're easy in the sense that at least we can approach them, we can try to solve them. They're tractable. They're not intractable. They may have an answer. That's what I mean. Whether a person is studying consciousness at the level of the hard problem or the easy problems, consciousness studies should ultimately do one thing and one thing only, and that is to connect third-person objective data, that is the quantitative data obtained from using EEGs, MRIs, PET scans, transcranial magnetic stimulation, whatever fancy tool or toy that the neuroscientists choose to use to study the brain, to transfer all that objective data into something which can be verbally reported by the subject. The subject should say, yes, this is what I'm feeling right now as you're making this recording, as you're seeing this wave on my EEG. That's basically what the ultimate aim of all consciousness studies are. Trying to find a correlation between brain events and the actual conscious experience that we say are because of the brain events in the brain. Yeah. So let me go to a thorny issue in consciousness, that is trying to find a definition, a suitable definition. What is consciousness? Surprisingly, in spite of the fact that 20 years have passed since consciousness has become a really serious discipline in neuroscience, and so many thousands upon thousands of papers have been written from all sorts of people with all kinds of training, there's no consensus yet on what consciousness is. But is that something to worry about? Is that something that we should say, okay, since we can't define it, since we can't say what it is, should we not study it at all? Well, I feel no, you don't have to do such a thing. You can still study it, because physicists are doing the same thing. Physicists don't have a definition for space or time or matter or electricity or any of these things, because they're so primitive, so fundamental, so basic that you can't get any deeper than them. You have to use those elements to explain everything else in the world. And that's the basic minimum construct. So perhaps consciousness falls into that category of thought. Perhaps it's just something that you cannot break down into anything simpler. It's just like electricity. What is electricity? You can't define it. It's some kind of energy. Then what is energy? So you're like, you go run in circles. You don't have a real understanding of what it is at a basic level. Now, a more thorny issue. Why should we even have consciousness? Is an animal conscious? Is a dog conscious? Is a cat conscious? Nematodes, worms, are they conscious? Bacteria conscious? Are virus conscious? So that's a very interesting question. Or is it just us humans who are conscious? So even if all of life is conscious, why do we need it? Why do we need consciousness? Well, just like, we don't really need to know what consciousness is, we don't really need to know why we need it in order to study it. But people have put forward different theories. One theory by Thomas Huxley is called epiphenomenalism. What that simply means is, an easy way to think of it is this: if you get into your car and switch on the ignition and hit the accelerator, the car starts moving forward. And as it's moving forward, the engine starts producing noise. The noise produced by the engine is just a natural byproduct of the fact that it's moving. But the noise itself does not do anything to the motion of the car. The noise cannot stop the car or push the car to go faster. Right? So perhaps consciousness is something like that. The brain, just because it functions, this consciousness thing, this magical thing appears, but consciousness itself cannot affect anything that's going on in the brain. In other words, physical events in the brain can result in mental states, but mental states like joy or happiness cannot influence sodium or potassium to go into or out of the membrane of the cell. All right, another theory comes from the theory of evolution. That is, theory of evolution has it that all living life on Earth comes from simpler organisms, perhaps blue-green cyanobacteria. Okay, so during the phase or during the epochs of evolution, what happened is the brain underwent significant remorphing and restructuring. And in the process, some layers were added, some structures were added to the brain, some layers and some structures were removed from the brain. Perhaps, during that restructuring process, one particular layer which we're still clueless about, one particular structure which we're still searching for, suddenly gave rise to that magical thing called consciousness. Now, the evidence that this camp uses to back it is the existence of a spot in the retina of the eye. It's called the blind spot. The blind spot is just one tiny spot in the entire retina where if light falls on it, you cannot see anything. Why? Because that area doesn't have something called rods and cones. Now the question is, why does the eye even need that? Why does the retina need a part which doesn't see anything? So there's no answer to that, except the fact that perhaps during the development of the retina, it underwent a series of restructuring phases in which one particular spot ended up totally functionless. So using that kind of reasoning, they say that perhaps consciousness came about because of this restructuring of the brain. But I don't really go for that, because the thing is, and at one point in medical practice, when a person had an inflamed tonsils called tonsillitis, what the doctor would do is remove the tonsils. We call it tonsillectomy. If you have an inflamed appendicitis, you remove the appendix. And the reasoning behind that was that, well, the appendix has no function, the tonsils have no function, so get rid of it anyway. But very recently they found a function for both those things. So just because something doesn't have a function doesn't mean that have a function that we know about doesn't mean that it doesn't really have a function. It may have a function with time. Time may prove what it is. And then the third theory is that of William James. Well, he says that, well, perhaps consciousness is unique to us because it helps us survive in the jungle that we're in. If you're in a desert, stranded in a desert, and you're thirsty, and if you look out into the horizon, you may see a shimmer of light, and you may think that's a source of water, a pond or an oasis, and you may end up wasting whatever little energy you have going in search for it. But then when you reach there, you find out there's nothing there, it's just a mirage. So if you have this convenient thing called consciousness, you would actually know that, okay, that's not a source of water, it's not a water body, it's most likely a mirage, and you can avoid compromising on your survivability. So that's another theory. Perhaps consciousness is the thing which helps us survive. That's why we have it. And okay, so here, this is very interesting. This is one of the peculiar things about science. We don't know how to define consciousness. We don't know why we have it, but there's no shortage whatsoever in the number of theories that are used to explain it. So you can see here, this is a list of all the theories which are currently being studied in great detail. I don't have time to go through each of these theories. All you have to know is, though we don't know what it is or why we have it, scientists are still very busy in their labs working on it. Now, there are two to three different ways that a neuroscientist can approach the study of consciousness. One is a direct way. The direct way is just by asking the subject or the guinea pig, the human guinea pig, what are you feeling right now? What is your internal experience? And the person gives his report. Okay, I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that. Then there's an indirect approach, which is more objective, where in this case you give a task and you ask the subject to choose one object in that task and reject the other. So that's a more indirect way of actually assessing the level of consciousness of a person. It's called the forced choice task. And then there's a third method which combines both of them. I'll give you an example of the direct approach. If you look at the the cube over here, it's called the Necker cube optical illusion. If you look at it long enough, you'll see that after some time, the orientation of the cube tends to shift. It tends to flicker between two states. In one state, it's like this, pointing downwards, pointing upwards towards the right, and over here it's pointing downwards towards the left. But at what point does your perception of the cube change from right to left? Well, that's something that we cannot tell using any device, EEG or PET or MRI. All we can do is we can ask, okay, now is it pointing to the right or is it pointing upwards to the left? And the person has to report it. So this is one example of a method of studying, a direct method of studying consciousness. The next method is the forced choice task. For example, here there's a monkey. On a screen there are two objects, object A and object B. The task is the monkey should turn his eyeballs and cast his gaze on object A and not on object B. So every time he does that, one peculiar part of the brain lights up. That is, when he chooses one object and refuses to look at the other object, one particular part of the brain lights up. So from that, we can tell, okay, this part of the brain is specialized in choosing that particular object. So that's an indirect way of studying consciousness. Now, a very interesting problem in neuroscience, it's one of the most interesting problems. It's the one which, if we can crack this, we can crack the hard problem of consciousness. It's called the binding problem. Now, what is the binding problem? I'll try to explain it with this picture. This is a picture. If I ask you, what is this? You'll say it's an apple. If I ask you, what is it again? You may say it's a red apple. If I ask you again, you may say it's a red apple, which is rounded, it's shiny, and it has a green top and a small sprout coming out from the top end. So the interesting thing is you're able to describe detailed features about the apple, the properties of the apple, but you don't realize it. It's not one single object you're describing. This thing, when it goes into your brain, it gets split into so many different pieces. One part of the information goes to process color, that it's red, not green or yellow or black or blue. One part goes to process the shape, that it's round, it's not square. One part goes to process the sprout that's coming out from the top end. So you have different parts of the brain that is actually splitting the information into small little small little parcels, processing different kinds of information regarding shape, size, color, edge, contrast, contour, etc. So you can see this here. When you look at an apple, the fact that it is an apple and not an orange is processed by this part of the brain. The part of the brain which says that, okay, the apple is in your left side, not on your right side, that's processed by this top part of the brain. So imagine that a single object, its various properties have been split like a superhighway into different parts, into different components, and it's being processed in different parts of the brain. It's akin to a little child given a toy car. He gets the toy car, the first thing he does, he starts taking off the wheels, taking off the doors, starts splitting it into pieces. This is exactly what the brain does. The brain breaks apart information that's stored in an object in the environment. But then, like any other good child, before the parent sees it, what he's done, he puts everything back together again. Because if the apple is split into so many little pieces, how can we ever perceive it as a single apple? So the brain has to bring everything together, put it back together. So this part of splitting the object, that's called a segregation problem. How does the brain do that? How does it split it into pieces? And the other is the combination problem. How does it bring all the pieces together and fuse them once again to say that it's one apple? One example is this. You see here a blue square and a yellow circle. This consists of, that you have one set of neurons which say that this is blue, another set of neurons that says it's a square, another set of neurons which says this is a circle, another set of neurons which says it's a yellow circle. So you have not less than 4 sets of neurons in different corners of the brain processing these two objects. That's the segregation problem. The fact that you're able to say that this is a blue square and a yellow circle and not a yellow square and a blue circle, that it doesn't mix and match, the ability to bring it together in a cohesive way, that's your combination problem. So these two things together make up the binding problem. So where does this happen? Where does the splitting happen? Where does the combination happen? Where does the fusion happen? And most importantly, where does it's an apple, it's a red apple. Where does that happen? We have no clue about it. But so we've postulated a theory saying that, this is the outer part of the brain, it's called the cortex. The very deep structure inside of the center of the brain, that's called the thalamus. There are many wires which connect the thalamus to the cortex, and the petrol for that comes through the thalamus, the information comes through this red thing here that's called the brain stem. So the information that goes up through the thalamus to the cortex, when that information happens to be in a frequency range of 30 to 45 hertz, that's called the gamma frequency. Once it reaches that range, we say binding happens and awareness happens. So this is one theory of consciousness, that when there's a activity going on between the cortex above and the thalamus below, this exchange of information at 30 to 40 hertz frequency, we become aware of everything in our surroundings. Now, this is very interesting. This is a recent effort that is to try to quantify consciousness. That is, can we bring everything down to a number? Just like we can say, okay, the temperature of this room is, let's say, 25 degrees Celsius. Can we actually say that a person who's sleeping, you can associate a number 0 consciousness, or a person who's wide awake and alert and attentive, a number 1, and someone who's drowsy and is about to fall asleep, 0.5, somewhere in between? Well, that's called quantifying consciousness, and many neuroscientists are working on that. They're trying to create parameters to actually say, okay, when the number is this much, the person is alert. When the number is this much, he's asleep, etc. And the various toys that neuroscientists use, the most popular one is called functional magnetic resonance imaging. Using this toy, you can actually see thought in real time as it's happening. Well, with a slight delay, of course. And then you have something called positron emission tomography. These are all the various tools. I'll just very quickly tell you what fMRI is. This is the most popular tool used by neuroscientists. You can see here, this is a picture of the brain scan from an fMRI study. So the spots that you see colored in red, those are the most active parts of the brain. The colors, the place which is colored blue, those are kind of inactive. It's not inactive, it's just less active, least active. So when you give a task to a person when he's lying down inside of this big magnetic coil, you can actually see which parts of the brain are most active when he's doing that particular activity. So if he's thinking happy thoughts, you see, let's say, the front part of his brain lighting up. Immediately you say that, okay, if a person has to be happy, it means this 2 regions of the brain have to be activated. I'm just giving an example here. So, but the problem with this method is that you can't use it to study language. That is, because even the slightest movement of the head as you're doing the scan can make the total, the picture fuzzy. To study language, we have another similar thing. It's called PET. So this studies, instead of oxygen consumption in the brain, it studies the glucose consumption in the brain, and it tries to map that out. Then you have EEG. This is the relatively cheaper toy that neuroscientists use. It's more affordable. So here you have the electrical field that the brain generates. You try to keep track of it and see what's happening, what changes are happening. Then you have a very new toy. It's called magnetic encephalography. Here you're actually trying to plot the magnetic fields that the brain produces. And this is a very interesting thing. It's a recent technology. It's called deep brain stimulation. So here what they do is they actually pass current. They actually implant an electrode into the brain right here, and they try to pass current into the thalamus of people who have lost consciousness for a very prolonged period of time. They're called comatose patients, and they've had some recent success in recent years to actually awaken people who are in a coma state. Then you have something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you actually apply a rounded coil on the top of the head and you blast a current through the brain, and what happens is if you place it on the right side of your head and switch it on, the left side of your body moves. If you place it on your left side, the right side of the body moves. If you place it on the back of your head, you get visual hallucinations. This was actually invented by one of my professors who, where I worked in UK. His name is Tony Barker, and it could be, maybe you could say it's one of the cheapest toys available to do neuroscience. Now, in the medical field, we don't have time for psychology, philosophy, or any of these things. We've got to know what we're talking about. We've got to know what consciousness is, whether the patient is conscious or unconscious, before we can label him in a comatose state. We can't fool around over there. We have to know what we're doing. So in the medical field, we have very rigorous definitions for consciousness. A person in the locked-in syndrome, he's fully conscious. He's fully aware of everything that's going around him, but sadly, he's not able to make any response for whatever reason. He can't lift his hand. He can't do anything at all except maybe blink his eyelids. And as you go down the scale, you can see the degree of awareness keeps decreasing from locked-in syndrome to minimally conscious to finally brain death, where the person is not at all there. He may have left the body altogether. And finally, we have something called neural correlates of consciousness. This is the holy grail of neuroscience. This is what neuroscientists are all after, particularly the ones who are studying consciousness. You can see here a picture of a man looking at a scene with a dog in it. So the visual information about the dog enters the brain, and different parts of the brain, neurons start firing away, and it registers that, yes, there's a dog out there. So this is what neuroscientists are trying to do. They put some sort of a stimulus, in this case, a dog, out there in the environment, and they try to keep track of what's going on inside the brain in the form of neural activity, which registers the fact that, yes, there's a dog, I'm aware of it out there. That's called the neural correlate of consciousness. So one example of neural correlate of consciousness is this area in the brain. It's called the fusiform face area. It's somewhere near the back of the brain. It lights up every time you see a face. In fact, even if you draw a smiley with two dots and smile like that and look at it, that part of the brain gets activated. So it just shows that human beings are encoded, ingrained, hardwired to recognize faces. In fact, people who have brain damage in this region, they lose the ability to recognize faces. Even their most loved one who they've lived with for 30, 40 years, they can no longer recognize them as someone they know. They can't name the person. That's called prosopagnosia. Now, there are problems with NCC as well, neural correlates of consciousness. One problem is this, just because...
Just a minute, Dr. Thomas, could you able to wind up very fast?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Just one moment. Yeah, if the brain, just because the brain is active when a particular activity is going on, it doesn't mean that, yes, okay, it's like plotting the different countries on a globe. Okay, this is America, this is India, this is China. It doesn't really help. I mean, it doesn't tell you why should consciousness come out because this part of the brain is active. That question is still left to open. And then again, the problem of assessing the level of consciousness, and the fact that it depends purely on the ability of the subject to say, yes, I'm feeling this now, I'm feeling that now. So reportability, again, that when reportability comes into the picture, you lose objectivity. And no longer can you make reliable statements where you can say, yes, this is an exact fact, this is a true fact. All right then, so future challenges. I'll just say one future challenge, that is, would it be possible one day to actually create consciousness and implant it into an artificial substrate medium? Just like we have consciousness in here, somewhere in the brain. Can we do that with silicon chips? Can we do that with transistors? Can we make an AI and make it do everything that we do? Can it feel? Can it feel happy, sad? Can it react to things in the environment on its own without being told? So that's a big challenge, and perhaps if we understand the conundrum, the hard problem of consciousness, perhaps one day we can actually achieve that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for a very lucid presentation about starting from basics to the future challenges. The take-home message from Dr. Thomas' presentation is there's still two big questions of why and how of consciousness is not known. All the tools that Dr. Thomas has mentioned is to evaluate the how of consciousness, but not about the why of consciousness. So still, if you ask why of consciousness, I don't know whether we have any different answer for that's why of consciousness. Probably, I think here where the twilight zone between the philosophy and other branches of science could give us some light. So in this direction, now I invite Ms. Shah to present her thoughts on scope of consciousness studies in Buddhist philosophy. And like Dr. Thomas, she also has a very varied and a wide spectrum of interest, from films to visual artists, to cultural activities, to philosophy, right, and so many other activities. Presently, she is studying Nalanda Diploma and Master's Program of Buddhist Philosophy in Tibet House. Ms. Shah.
Okay, so thank you very much to all the conference organizers and all the volunteers working very hard behind the scenes, especially Tibet House, CKSL, and IIWC. My deepest gratitude to Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdol for giving me this very meaningful opportunity to connect with all of you and for creating this precious interdisciplinary situation so we can all learn and grow together. And of course, thanks to the audience for being here by keenly and actively participating. You complete the whole process. So I must make a disclaimer that since I find myself in this august gathering of very learned and distinguished scholars and practitioners, that I'm neither of those two. And I'm merely a student of Buddha's vast and profound teachings. And I got very drawn to Buddhist philosophy and practice in the first place because of a few very particular reasons. And I would like to list those reasons because they're connected to the presentation I'm going to make. So, in the first place, the exposition of reality as discovered by the Buddha and the path to emancipation are both phenomena that can be initially obtained on the basis of logic and reasoning. It's an empirical and experiential in nature. You don't have to simply believe something because some higher authority is telling you that it is like that. It has a ground of non-discrimination, as in no negative discrimination. It's secular. It has many secular aspects. It really encourages people to be very objective in their approach. And because it has been tried and tested for more than 2,500 years, and consistently it has yielded results of producing very wise, compassionate, sane, loving human beings who are not at war with themselves or others, but instead are striving to create a world which has peace and harmony. And perhaps His Holiness the Dalai Lama would be the exemplar of this. Having said that, two more points to note, that in the Nalanda Buddhist tradition, the words mind, consciousness, and awareness are used interchangeably. And I'm going to follow that convention. And that every time I speak about the subject and the object, by the subject I refer to the mind or the consciousness, and by the object I refer to the primary object that this consciousness is interacting with or engaging with. So I want us to take a moment to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of my life? It is a very down-to-earth and simple fact. It's a very down-to-earth and basic fact that all of us desire happiness and wish to avoid suffering. This very simple fact is so significant that it cannot be overstated and it should not be overlooked. Nobody really comes to, these kind of explorations saying, I'm so happy, please remove my happiness. And if we went a step further, not only do I not want to be miserable, I actually don't want any misery if possible, and I want maximum happiness. That is, if I could abide in a state of tranquility, no matter what the external circumstances, then would I like to be in such a state? So among the many significant discoveries that Buddha made about reality and truth, there are three that I would like to highlight. The first one is the harmony of the emptiness of independent existence and that of interdependent origination. We have heard about this. The second, the efficacious that all impermanent phenomena are governed by the efficacious workings of the law of cause and effect. And third, which I find is perhaps very startling, is that Buddha discovered something very counterintuitive perhaps about the nature of our mind. Buddha discovered that the true nature of our mind is perfectly pure, undefiled, endowed with infinite love, fearlessness, and it's very, very powerful, perhaps the most powerful phenomena in the world. Now, why do I say that this is a startling discovery? Is because when we observe the current state of our mind, and I'm assuming I'm talking about ordinary, mundane people like myself, we find that on the contrary, we're full of fears and we lack the bliss of tranquility. So that's the current state, perhaps. We kind of just vary between, different degrees of this. So naturally the question arises, why is this so? If the true nature of our mind is so beautiful, wise, powerful, full of love, then why are we languishing in the cesspit of miseries, depression, anxieties, and if I were to put it more crudely, why are we rolling around in the same old shit? So if you encounter such information, then sooner or later, you're bound to ask these questions, which is one, that if this is my true nature, then what is obstructing this true nature of my mind from shining through? Second, how does it obstruct it? What is the mechanism? And third, how can I remove these obscurations both for myself as well as for my loved ones? These are exactly the questions that propelled the Prince Siddhartha to undertake this journey which culminated in his full awakening, whereby he came to be known as the Gautam Buddha. Buddha found that we make fundamental mistakes about the nature of reality of the object as well as of the subject. To summarize that, and also we should understand, we need to also define what do we mean about this distortion. What we're saying is that there is some kind of ignorance. Ignorance is a state of mind whose apprehension of the object does not tally with the reality, and wisdom, whose definition just got hidden behind because of some formatting issue between Mac and PCs. It's saying that wisdom is a state of mind whose apprehension of the object tallies with the reality. But we're not just talking about any ignorance or any wisdom, because there are multiple forms of ignorances and wisdoms. We're specifically here talking about a very specialized form of ignorance, which is known as the self-grasping ignorance, or the ignorance that grasps at the independent existence of phenomena. And to counter that, we have to introduce a wisdom, which is exactly the opposite of this ignorance, which is the wisdom which knows experientially and sees directly that the reality is empty of independent existence. So of course, as one goes down, the other goes up. So the topic of this brings me actually then to the topic of my talk, which is when we talk about the distortion on the object that is extensively studied, reflected, meditated upon in the area of philosophy, in Buddhist philosophy, and then we talk about the distortion on the subject, we study about it in consciousness studies or psychology, or what you may call also epistemology. So I also would like to start with a quote of Buddha, which is the opening two verses of the Dhammapada, which Madam in the morning also read, which says, "Mind is the chief and precedes them all. If with an impure mind one acts or speaks, miseries follow, like a cart following an ox." Thankfully, Buddha did not stop there. And then Buddha said, mind is the chief and precedes them all, and if with a pure mind one acts or speaks, happiness follows like a shadow that never leaves. So maybe one is our current state, and one is speaking about when we reach the true nature of our mind state. They're pretty self-explanatory. So what I want to say is that it's very clear that Buddha laid great emphasis on understanding the mind, its nature, functioning, and the importance of training the mind. It plays a very crucial role, the state of our mind, in our experiences of happiness or unhappiness, and also the mind has a very intricate and innate connection to our actions, which ties in with the law of karma, the law of causation, which also then kind of sets the stage for our future happiness or miseries. So what is the scope of consciousness in Buddhist philosophy? And I would like to highlight some very important points which are dealt with in this vast, ocean, this Mahasagar, which is, of course, what's the definition of mind, what's the nature of mind. This long list is not to inundate you, but just to give you a flavor that obviously we can't cover everything in 20 minutes, but you should know that mind's ultimate potential, also known as Buddha nature, mind as the creator of happiness and suffering, mind and karma, the different levels of mind, gross or subtle, types of mind, mind and its functions, and then it goes on to afflictions, transforming disturbing emotions, the role of meditation in, bringing your happiness, and then why the precious human life is the best situation in which you can undertake this work on dealing with your mind or consciousness. Okay, so this is a list of some lists of how the mind is divided. And, any particular binary is like all different forms of mind would fit into any of those categories. And I want to specifically draw your attention here to the cognitive mind and the affective mind. So, thankfully, a lot of things have been said to make my task a little bit easier. And I'm just going to create a scenario that you are in a desert for the last 36 hours. You've not had any water to drink, and now you're very thirsty. And I present this to you. So if I ask you, what is this? What's your answer? A glass of water. Good. And if I ask you, would you like to have it? Do you like it? Yes. Okay, great. And then if I show you this and I ask you, what is this? A glass of dirty water. Thank you. And would you like to have this if you had the choice between these two? No. So very good. What you have done actually is you have experientially identified what is a cognitive mind and what is an affective mind. Because when you look at the glass of water, or this image rather, and you say, this is a glass of water, that's called a cognitive event. And when you say, yes, I like to have it, there is a pull, there is some affect. There's an affinity, and this is what we call the affective mind in very simple terms. So now you can see what I would want to explore, having established what's a cognitive mind and what's an affective mind. What is the relationship between these two? How is the cognitive mind related to the affective mind? So you could see that when you cognize this glass of water, having been thirsty for the last 38 hours, you cognize this water and you say, I want it, right? Now, I say, sure, you can have it. And I produce a microscope and I show you the same glass of water through the microscope, and what you begin to see is this. And now I ask you, are you exactly as excited to have the glass of water as you did when you saw the earlier image? And the answer is, I don't know. That looks a bit strange. That has to go through my intestines, I'm not so sure. And I say, okay, let's go a step further. And we look at it through electron microscope, and you start to see the subatomic particles. And then I ask you, so what's your feeling right now? So what we establish from this is not just the relationship of cognition to affect, but what you also see is that your affect vis-a-vis the same object changes depending on how you cognize it. So at first you may have thought, oh, the source of my happiness is out there in that glass of water. If the source of your happiness is out there in that glass of water, then why are you not so happy when you see the glass of water like this? It should make you equally happy, but it doesn't. Why? Because the source of your happiness, the external object, is just a trigger. And it triggers a feeling inside you. And the feeling can be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, where you may say, I'm very indifferent. And depending on that feeling, you have some mental intention. So this is very beautifully captured in what is known as the 5 omnipresent mental factors. But before we go into that label, I just wanted to explore with you how beautifully, systematically, and intricately in detail our entire process and mechanism of working of our mind is mapped out. So basically you have contact with the object. Then you pay attention to it, because if you don't pay attention to it, then you're paying attention to something else. But when you do pay attention to it, you have some discernment, you have some form of discrimination, a positive discrimination. You decide, yes, it's a glass of water, this is not a bunch of atoms, some. And then based on that, a feeling arises, and then a mental intention arises. So the discernment or the discrimination, where you discriminated and said this is glass of water, or this is a glass of atoms, or this is dirty water, that's the cognitive event. And that leads to the affective event, which is the feeling. So this is called the 5 omnipresent mental factors. So I would like to just elaborate on this a little bit more. So you can see very easily that you have some cognition, which leads to the affect or the feeling, which leads to a mental action or intention, which is also known as karma. And that manifests your physical or verbal actions or movements in the world. And the first 3 of these are all mental states. And the last one is the outward behavior which is visible to other people. And depending on how you cognize the object, that will finally determine whether your mental intention as well as your physical and verbal actions in the world, are they harmful or are they beneficial? So this becomes extremely important for us to understand. Now, because this is so important, there are so many, one really went deeper and said, okay, so this cognition is so important. How can I understand it better? How do my miseries arise? How can I reach a state of transcendental happiness, of a non-relative happiness? So there, when we look at the aspect of the cognitive, what Buddha said, that there is a fundamental error that you make about the object. That error, when you make that, it happens through, you look at the object in a distorted way, and you have this ignorance which grasps at the independent existence. So this is the cognitive error, and then follows certain step of things. Some of this is already mirrored in the 5 omnipresent mental factors, the way we saw how things arose, and the result is misery. And when you reverse this process, then this is what happens. You introduce the wisdom of emptiness to recognize things as they are, which is that they're empty of independent existence. And by that process, step by step, automatically, all the other problems that were stacked on that root problem are eliminated, and you cease your miseries. So, right. So I just wanted to, just share with you that usually, cognition, when you look at a glass of water and you say, how do you know it's water? You say, I saw it. And that's the validation, right? Like you are the witness and you validate it and you just say, I just saw it. And so it is like that. But not everything we see tallies with reality. And what Buddha is saying, actually, mostly everything and how you engage with things does not tally with reality. Even though you think you're seeing reality, there's a gap. And you need to mind that gap. So for that, I just, brought some very simple examples of illusions, optical illusions that we encounter in our life every day. So you feel that the top line is longer than the bottom one, but actually they are the same length. And for example, this is the Ebbinghaus illusion. You feel the circle on the left is larger than the circle on the right, but that's not the case. So it's just the first step we have to take in this journey is to begin to question, not believe that I am seeing reality, but begin to question at every point that what I am seeing and I think is reality might not actually tally with reality at all. So that brings me to finally the definition of the mind or consciousness in Buddhist philosophy. So the mind or consciousness is defined as an agent which is clear and knowing. And clear has both aspects of clear as well as luminosity. And to illustrate that better, what I did was that very often the mind is likened to a mirror. All the great teachers, they say, your mind is like a mirror. Why? Because the mind has these qualities that it's clear. Whatever you show to the mirror reflects in the mirror. If the mirror was dirty, it would not show up in the mirror. And so it's clear. Then, if there was no light, and you had the mirror and you had the object, but you switched off the light, again, no reflection would be formed. That's not the case with our mind. Even when you see darkness, you're able to see darkness. Why? Because mind has this quality that it is luminous. So there is this luminous quality to the mind, then it's clear. And then if you ask the mirror, do you know what you are seeing? The mirror will be like, no, I don't know what I'm seeing. But do you know what you are seeing? And the answer is yes. Even when you say, I don't know what I am seeing, you know that you don't know what you are seeing, so you do know. So the clear, luminous, and knowing quality is, mind is, or consciousness is clear, luminous, and knowing. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I'd like to just quote, he says, cognitive events possess the nature of knowing because of the fundamental nature of clarity that underlies all cognitive events. This is the mind's nature, the clear light nature of mind. So what are some, so we went to the definition, now let's look at the nature of mind. These are some of the characteristics that are spoken about in relation to mind. Clear, luminous, having the awareness quality. It's momentarily changing, yet it is eternal in the sense beginningless and endless. It's indestructible, non-material, no color, no shape. It has an introspective quality, the capacity to observe itself, and it's dependently originated like all other phenomena. Having said that, let's just have an overview. So you have the mind in general. It can be divided into the main mind and the mental factors, also mental functions. And the main mind can be gross, subtle, very subtle. Within the gross, we have the 5 sensory consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. Just take a moment and visualize or just imagine your most beautiful flower that you absolutely love. Just take a moment and think about this flower. When you do that, you have already had an experience of your mental consciousness. There is no object out there that you are engaging with. It's just your pure mental consciousness imagines this flower. There's probably an image of this flower in front of you. That's a way to separate between your sensory consciousness and your mental consciousness. Now, within the Buddhist philosophy and practice, because there's such an emphasis on knowing the mind, there are specific practices known as awareness of awareness practices, where you turn your attention from looking at the external object to looking at this mind itself, which has this knowing quality, the mind which knows, not what it knows, but the knowing agent itself. And then these mental factors, which are, what am I doing? Okay, let me just, I come here and then I'll go back. So these mind and mental factors, this is another division of mind, and I find it so beautiful. I feel so grateful for this opportunity, because while I was preparing, I had to revisit them. And literally the feeling I got was that, Buddha picked these 51 mental factors, functions of the mind. He highlighted that, saying that in your journey to achieve the 2 purposes of your life, of removing suffering and having maximum happiness, these are the mental qualities, functions that you should become aware of, and you should know both the wholesome ones as well as the unwholesome ones. The wholesome ones which you need to increase, and the unwholesome ones which you need to decrease. And I felt that it's a very beautiful mirror. If you just read some of those mental factors, that it's like, you can look at the mirror of these 51 mental factors at any point and ask yourself, what has changed in the last year or the last few months? Do I have more of these wholesome qualities? Do I have less of these unwholesome qualities? And if you do, that's a great barometer of knowing how you are progressing in your journey to achieve your 2 purposes, your 2 very basic fundamental purposes. Yes, I will just thank you. So just, like aspiration, admiration, concentration, intelligence. We already went quite a lot into the detail of the 5 omnipresent mental factors. And then, there are the root afflictions such as anger, aversion, desire, wrong views, ignorance. So it's a very, very interesting map, I feel. And then coming back to this division, so we touched on the gross and subtle, mental and sensory, and cognitive and affective. And now let's just look at, because the cognition is so important, there's an amazing presentation which is made on the 7-fold division, which is actually a division of the cognitive mind. And at the bottom you have, let's say, the most gross form of the cognitive mind, and on top you have the most, let's say, correct or valid cognition. So you can see that at the bottom, most of us may start with a deceptive or wrong cognitive event, which is that you may think that the true nature of mind is not pure. And then slowly you might come to this conference and you may hear, but they said the true nature of my mind is so pure. And so then a doubt might arise in your mind, and then you move to a doubting consciousness. You may feel like, okay, it could be either of those. Yes, it could be pure, it could be unpure. And then you get more information, and you might move to number 4, which is the correctly assuming consciousness, that you have more information, you have solid ground of reasoning, and then you say, yes, the true nature of mind is pure because of, let's say, this reason, but you may still not have experience of it. It's like, parroting something that you have learned in class. And a lot of emphasis is placed in Buddhism on experiential knowledge, not just second-hand knowing, but knowing firsthand. So then you might move with a lot of reasoning and logic. You may gain through your own reflection a very solid basis of conviction that yes, the true nature of my mind is pure. And from there you might move into a direct valid experience through certain contemplative practices where you familiarize yourself with this knowledge you have one-pointedly obtained, and then you might have a direct valid perception of this knowledge. Okay, that's amazing. So I would like to say that it is very important. There's something called the precious human life. In Buddhism we speak not just about human life, but within that precious human life. And this is one of the best situations for us to work on our mind. So it's really a gift what we have, this life right now, that we are all present here. And it presents an opportunity for us to realize our true purposes. And this will ensure that not only do you have good physical health, not only do you have the temporal happiness of this life, but you also have very long-term, permanent, irreversible, lasting happiness. With that, I would like to end with a quote from Buddha, which says, "Do not commit any non-virtuous actions or unwholesome actions. Perform only perfect wholesome actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. Tame your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rimsha, for such a wonderful journey that she took of the cognitive psychology, and it was more like a personal experience and phenomenology. So she has covered both the cognitive psychology and the neurophenomenology, if I think. So with this, I'll invite Dr. Matthew to share his views on scope of consciousness and neuroscience, Buddhist philosophy, and quantum mechanics. However, Dr. Matthew is well known for the audience. He has already been introduced twice to the audience. So in the interest of time, I just directly invite Dr. Matthew.
So after a sumptuous meal and also dense presentations by my two panelists, and then the third of mine, I am absolutely sure that though there was no collapse of the wave function, but there is a collapse of the consciousness. So what I thought is that, something maybe starting with a joke. I don't know whether it happened to our Geshe-la, Damdul Dorji, that there was a disciple, I'm just joking, came to him and asked, "Can I send an email?" And then, probably Geshe-la Damdul told him, "Yes, you can send an email, but without an attachment." So we were all listening to quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and Buddhist philosophy. So according to the Madhyamaka Buddhism, I think Arya Nagarjuna has said that emptiness itself is emptiness. So therefore we don't need to attach to any of these quantum mechanics or neuroscience or Buddhist philosophy. but we are trying to understand this phenomenon, what is known as consciousness. And as one of the speakers was speaking about that, the present century is for quantum mechanics, next one to something else. But I think that an integrated effect of all these three important disciplines, quantum mechanics, Buddhist philosophy, and neuroscience, definitely will have great impact in the 21st century. And I am happy to hear that the present director of consciousness studies at NIMHANS, for the first time, he was scouting for faculty members from here. So,
Let me make it very clear. I'm not really finding of any faculty members here because this will be overstatement. I'm from because when father says NIMHAS, I represent the government. Please let me make it very clear.
Yes,
it is for the general information about the audience. In case if you find yourself you're qualified for this, if the advertisement comes, please keep your eyes and ears open. That's what I am.
well, I am seeing that, in a very positive note, that, some years ago, we don't have any kind of consciousness studies in India, but abroad, Europe and the United States, we have plenty of them. And then seriously, the Indian scholars and institutions are taking, and that is something very positively. So I am absolutely sure that this has been because of the, various institutions and people like Geshe-la, Damdul, and many others. So I was one of the persons who are so much interested in these consciousness studies. I have organized a number of such conferences, national and international, collaborated with many others like Geshe-la. So definitely, I think it is important to have these consciousness conferences more frequently and centers like this. So congratulations to the NIMHANS as well as to Geshe-la and the other organizers. And I am grateful that you have invited me. And with this note, and I think I will enter into what I am going to speak. Okay. I think this is the way. Okay. So as so we have this matter, neuroscience, life, and Buddhist philosophy. These are a very important disciplines for this 21st century. And quantum mechanics, you have heard much about from different perspectives. This is something which I am just in a nutshell. I am speaking about what is this quantum. Quantum is the smallest divisible element of energy that is given by H. Planck's constant, given by this technical term 10 to the power of minus 34 joules per second. So it was Max Planck who initiated studying about the heat absorption and emission, and he came out with the concept that it is absorbed as well as it is emitted in terms of this quantum. This has been extended by Albert Einstein in explaining all kinds of radiations, and this has been further extended by Niels Bohr to explain the hydrogen spectrum, that is the quantum jump or quantum leap. And then we hear about the interpretational problems, that is particles as wave, given by de Broglie. And then basing on that, we have wave mechanics, which was given by Schrödinger, and then matrix mechanics given by Werner Heisenberg. So these are two mathematical tools in the Hilbert space. Today we heard Professor Partha Ghosh speaking about the Hilbert space. It is a mathematical space, and this wave mechanics and matrix mechanics are two subsets in the Hilbert space. And then we have the interpretational principles of uncertainty, complementarity, probability leading to indeterminism. So this is indeterminism is absolutely counter to the classical physics, that you cannot exactly determine the presence of a particle, or the matter itself is indeterminate. We may not be able to know in its fullness. So we have this quantum schism between the completeness and incompleteness led by Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr. So whether that is why he was also saying that, God doesn't play dice, because wave and particle, sometimes the matter is behaving as particle, some other time it as a wave. So was trying to give an explanation, but Einstein came up with the critical questions, which was later developed into the EPR thought experiments, Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen thought experiment, which has given rise to the problem of non-locality, which has been discovered later by Aspect and many others. So there are different interpretational problems given by many physicists or quantum physicists, try to give different interpretations. One of the prominent interpretations was given by David Bohm, and he was trying to give an explanation in terms of a quantum potential, that a particle will be guided by a wave. The quantum potential as a kind of a wave, and that quantum potential will be a kind of a guide for the particle. So he developed the ontological interpretation, and it has been shown has some meaningful existence, and there were so many research and studies were conducted, but there were also critical people like the original Copenhagen interpretation. People will be saying that this is not really meaningful, and it has, but this has a kind of influence, or it can have some aspect of interpreting the body-mind problem. So how that the body-mind problem could be that, that the mind can be considered as a quantum potential, which will be capable of guiding the physical body. So whether it is a realistic interpretation or a metaphorical interpretation, to all those conceptual problems, I think it has yet to be realized. So in giving this wave and particle interpretation together, or the quantum potential interpretation given by David Bohm, further research were done by Partha Ghosh and Deepankar Home. That was the reason why today I said that he has contributed much to the development of quantum mechanics, and also extending this concept into the body-mind problem, which later David Bohm and Basil Hiley have extended further into it. So whether it is a realistic interpretation that the mind is something like a quantum potential that is guiding the body, or whether it is a metaphorical that has yet to be researched and discovered. So this just remain in the theoretical level. So what is this neuroscience? Today also we heard from Professor Mukhopadhyaya that the signaling, and then the neuroscience, and the neural processes. So today what is the neuroscience is taking into understanding what is really happening with our consciousness. So there is one of the research studies which speaks about that suppose I am lifting my hand, there will be the firing of neurons in some particular area of the brain. And suppose that I am just keeping my hand here, but still I am thinking that I am lifting my hand. And it seems that it has been discovered by scientists that the same neurons will be firing. So you don't need to lift the hand, but thinking itself that you are lifting, that can have an impact into the neural networking. So that is the place where we can have the Buddhist philosophy as a spirituality. So to me, Buddhist philosophy, or all these categories which Tejal Shah was presenting, and Professor Chattopadhyaya was also giving that the different philosophical tradition, what is the role of those philosophical categories they were making. The essential methodology of understanding the mind through the categories in order to transform the mind or the consciousness or the human personality. So that is exactly what, to me, I think that the greatest philosophical traditions were creating such theories in order to understand mind or consciousness, so that they will be capable of transforming it. And as the Nalanda masters were, therefore, I think, and one of the important spiritual masters is Shantideva, which I am not an expert, but here are great masters who have gone through it in several years of studies. I think in the Geshe studies, almost an year you had to study this Shantideva. There was Bodhisattva Charyavadara. So what it is speaking about that, how to tame your consciousness, how to transform your consciousness. So therefore, this quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and the mindfulness or the meditation can really transform the human personality. So, in order to create a bodhicitta or a stable consciousness, so by purifying the bad deeds, adopting the spirit of enlightenment, using consciousness, grading awareness, the practice of patience, practice of joyous effort, the practice of meditative concentration, the perfection of wisdom. So these are all needing a kind of a dedication, so that the human person is with wellness, wholeness, and holiness. So that is the ultimate aim of this Buddhist philosophical tradition, and that is the reason why they have created so much of these theories, so that a person will be capable of transforming his or her consciousness. And I think the quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and the Buddhist philosophy is given to us so that we may transform ourselves. We be endowed with happiness. We be endowed with wholeness and wellness. And I think this is what is important for us today. Not to split up what is exactly meant by mind, whether it is existing or this consciousness is existing, but the ultimate aim is to transform and to keep a stable, happiness, peace. And I think this is what I wanted to summarize, that we as a human person, to stable forms of consciousness, to transform ourselves as an individual, as in the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Father, for your wonderful presentation. So, Father's take-home message is that we should know all how of consciousness and how to transform the consciousness into higher realms is to have wellness, wholeness, and holiness. And as far as wellness is concerned, yes, neuroscience we can talk. As a wholeness is concerned, I think the understanding of it from the conceptual knowledge, where the physics and neuroscience can really bring in a lot of insight. But holiness, I think we have to get into philosophy. Otherwise, it will be otherwise it will be just a knowledge. It can't be any transformative things. It's not possible unless we keep all these things into practice. So with this a few remarks, I'll open this session to audience. Please.
Yes, hello. This is a question for Dr. Joseph Thomas. So in your presentation, on one of your slides, the first bullet point mentioned that there's no agreed upon definition of consciousness currently within the field. Now the last bullet point on that same page, which you didn't actually read out to us, it said that the definition of consciousness is awareness of feeling, discrimination, some other mental factors, and of external states. So is that your definition that you're supplying, or is that a one that's agreed upon by some people?
That's a working definition, because the scientists cannot progress without giving some form of a definition. It's just an operational definition.
Do you mind if I just ask as a question, if that's the definition, then is a feeling consciousness? And if not, then is it something different than either consciousness or form?
From the point of view of neuroscience, I think consciousness is nothing other than feeling. It's just the feeling.
But then discrimination also? So, I'm sorry I'm making the point that if we say that consciousness is awareness of feeling and awareness of discrimination, it would imply that the discrimination and feeling are something separate that then consciousness is experiencing along with experiencing form.
I think consciousness is an umbrella term for those things. They include both.
It includes both.
Both. So it's like the two facets of what consciousness is.
Okay.
That you can't really split apart. It'll be like splitting hairs almost.
Okay. So consciousness, you would say, includes
feeling and discrimination, perception, and all sorts of things. Attention, memory, everything together. We call it consciousness.
Okay.
Yeah. The absence of any one of those things would make it something else.
Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My question is to Dr. Joseph Thomas, and I'm not from science background, but I have studied and heard that human minds are divided into three stages of conscience: subconscious, and unconscious. Here, my question is, there are two questions. One, while we are in our conscious stage, can we have a touch with our unconscious stage? Second question, I have read many people whom the medical science have declared as dead have come back to their life, and when they are in their conscious stage, they were able to explain to us very well whatever they have undergone when they were in that stage of whatever you call it as coma or dead stage. How does that happen? Is it true or can believe?
All right, I'll answer the second question first, because that's a truth statement what she said. There was a girl from UK. She had spent a holiday in Germany, and something happened, some accident happened, and she slipped into a coma. And she was in the hospital, and they didn't take her back to UK. They kept her there for some 10 years or something, a certain number of years. And somehow, surprisingly, she regained consciousness. No one knows how, she just regained consciousness. And she didn't know German. before she slipped into consciousness. But then when she came back, she could actually speak German. So the thing is, the nurses who used to come and take care of her, it seems she was listening to it, even though. So how did she do it? I don't think anyone knows how it's done. It's a total mystery how that happened. How did she learn when she was in a comatose state? So you can even pick up languages. This is one evidence. It's documented. Then the first question was about the conscious level, subconscious, unconscious. Well, this is a hypothetical way of dividing the mind into three tier system. It goes all the way back to Freud and people like him, who believe that the mind, when you're awake, you're conscious, and when you're asleep, it's not your conscious state which is working, but another level of mind called the subconscious. And in meditation, what happens is the subconscious and the conscious level of the mind, they talk to each other, they interact with each other. You may have heard many anecdotes of how mathematicians, they suddenly come up with solutions to their problems that they've been working on for maybe years. Suddenly it just flashes to them, oh my goodness, this is the way to do it, this is the way to solve it. You may have heard of musicians, composers who were just doing trivial things in their house, and suddenly a tune comes to their head and they decide, okay, let's take the instrument, let's try to put it to song, and a beautiful song comes out, a symphony comes out. So how does this happen? It's since we don't know how it happens, we divide the mind into these three levels. So and we say one of these levels, which is not operating at the other level, is doing that work. So that's just the way we are in science. We just make hypotheses.
I think I just wanted to answer or some explanation to this division. I think it was Carl Jung who divided into conscious and the unconscious, and I am very favoriting that interpretation rather than into three, but the conscious and the unconscious. And I have found, because as a hypnotherapist, I also do some kind of hypnotherapy, and I sometimes all on a sudden, whatever in the unconscious that was being gone deeper, which will not be able to be coming out in the conscious level. If you are healing the person in the unconscious, then it seems that that person is into wellness. That I have seen, and I don't know how this is happening. And then there also I found something fascinating is that you are giving audio signals to that person. That means you are giving some instructions. That person will be seeing this as visual images. So how all those things are interacting, and I don't know, but I think maybe under the leadership of Professor Ravindra, these are things which is very fascinating, which I think might be hidden in the unconscious level, and maybe coming. It could also be given some other neural interpretations.
I'll just give one more common example. All of us may have experienced it at some point. That is, if we're driving in a car from home to work, we don't necessarily think of using our hands to turn the steering right or left, or the gear, shifting gear. Suddenly we find ourselves at our destination, and we'll be scratching our heads wondering, how did we get here? Wait a minute, I crossed that traffic light? I don't remember doing that. So, but nonetheless, you're there at your place where you wanted to reach. How did that happen? It was not your conscious mind which is working. It was the level of mind which is below it. So we just name it subconscious. That's it. It's a very arbitrary definition. Well, if you say, is there such a thing as a subconscious? Well, if there isn't, how did that happen? Because consciousness by definition means awareness. So without awareness, you did something. So there must be something below the conscious level which is at work.
But it doesn't mean that for a good productivity, we should be always a conscious. All your learned skill will become unconscious sometime, because then it comes out automatically. That's what Dr. Thomas was telling about the driving. So with this, I think we are out of time. So the speakers will be available and you can discuss over the tea. So we had a wonderful session of the for today's afternoon, and where we discussed about the probabilities of knowing consciousness from the psychology, philosophy, and the neuroscience point of view. And all the speakers have really given their best. And I'm very sure that all the three speakers should get a very big round of applause from all of you. And I also thank the organizers giving us for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
I thank all the panelists for such enlightened talks and discussions. I would now request Dr. Father Matthew Chandrakunil to present a khatha and memento to Professor Ravindra Nagendra, the chair. Dr. Joseph Irving Thomas, please. Ms. Tejal Shah. Thank you, madam. Thank you, sirs. That concludes this particular session. Now we will have a tea break, and the next session will start at 4 o'clock. Thank you.